Hi everyone, this lesson covers the family and society. True or false? For most of history, marriage meant husbands worked while a wife gave up work and stayed home to care for children, do housework, and prep meals. While this seems to be an old-fashioned traditional marriage, in reality, this is false. For most of history, this type of family structure did not exist. In fact, the idea of a breadwinner dad who goes to work and a stay-at-home mom who stays home to take care of children and do housework is a fairly recent invention. This type of family is a historical anomaly, meaning it's one of the most rare type of family structures that has existed for all of human societies. It was prominent at one time in the 1950s, but for most of history, families did not look like this. This is often what is referred to as a traditional family, but historians and anthropologists know that there is no such thing as a traditional family. The traditional family of the 1950s is one of the least common family forms. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what is and should be considered a traditional family, since family structures change as time changes, as societies change. Furthermore, this term of the traditional family is often used to argue that this family form is better than others, but sociologists know and understand that family forms aren't necessarily better. Each era of the family had their advantages as well as disadvantages. Speaking of disadvantages of this quote-unquote traditional family of the 1950s, this was an era where a lot of women lost their economic power by becoming housewives, by giving up their place in public life and resorting to being kept in private life. They became dependent on a man's income, making it hard to be economically independent when things like divorce came up. During this era, women also felt a lot of pressure to be the perfect mom and the perfect wife, and were prescribed tons and tons of anti-anxiety and anti-depression drugs to try to deal with the stress and the depression of being a housewife. There was a lot of abuse both against the wife and against the child because the husband was supposed to be the disciplinarian of the home, and most of this abuse went unreported and was swept under the rug. Here's an advertisement depicting this era. It says, "Now she can cook breakfast again," and she's all smiles. This is an ad for an anti-anxiety drug that was directed at husbands. The other thing about the 1950s family is that it was fairly exclusively white. 25% of the population lived in poverty because a majority of cities were ignored while the U.S. government heavily subsidized the suburbs. Part of this subsidization came in the form of the GI Bill, which allowed low-interest loans for returning war veterans from World War II. However, when minorities tried to use the GI Bill, they were often denied at the local offices. Looking at divorce rates throughout the century, we can see there is certainly an increase in divorce throughout the century. However, it peaked in 1993 and since has declined for the last 25 years or so. In fact, we're no different now than we were in the 1970s. Second and third and fourth marriages, though, are still fairly common, especially since we're talking about people of all sorts of generations who are 40, 50, 60 years old and have grown up in an era where divorce is more common. This has resulted in blended families, families where couples bring children from previous marriages to form a single blended family. Same-sex marriages are more common than ever before as well. Obviously, with the passing of the federal law that made same-sex marriages legal, we saw an increase. There are still barriers, though, such as trying to adopt a child. This still proves to be difficult as there is still a lot of discrimination by both parents giving up their child to be adopted who feel that their child shouldn't be raised in a same-sex household, and local offices who find it difficult to work with same-sex couples since it's hard to find parents that are willing to give their children up for adoption to a couple in a same-sex household. Furthermore, single parenting is becoming more and more common, not just among folks with lower incomes, but also those with higher socioeconomic status, especially women. Women who are professionals, who are making lots of money and have high levels of income, are deciding to become single mothers. And you may be wondering why. The major reason is that these women report not wanting to have the marriage and have the romance and all of those things that people say you're supposed to have, but they do want a child in their life or multiple children in their lives, and they feel like that's important to them. And of course, being higher socioeconomic status allows them to be able to raise a child on their own. Of course, they're still going to come across difficulties, but nonetheless, you're seeing this become a pattern more and more as marriage is kind of seen as not as necessary as it was in the past. Couples with higher education are also more likely to say they don't ever want to have or plan to ever have children. These are known as child-free marriages, to the dismay of stepmothers everywhere. There's also an increase in cohabitating couples who don't plan to get married anytime soon, but do want to live together, sort of in this semi-married state. And there are a lot of reasons for this, but one of the most common are money, not being financially stable enough to be married, and also finishing school is one of the major reasons why couples decide to cohabitate for some time. Thinking about where these changes come from, one of the easiest routes to go is we've lost our moral compass, or we're just not, we just don't value marriage as much. Americans value marriage very much, especially compared to other countries. Our marriage rates are really, really high. We love marriage. We think it's great. The only difference is that our society isn't exactly compatible with marriage anymore. One of those things, driving forces, are the recent economic patterns that have occurred. It is much more difficult to end up in a financially stable situation where marriage is possible, especially a traditional marriage where a husband goes to work and a wife stays at home. Due to a economic pattern known as de-industrialization, where there was a decline in manufacturing and a huge emphasis on technology and service, it stopped being possible to graduate from high school and finding a well-paying job that will be able to afford you a house. On top of that, prices of everything have inflated heavily, making our wages, basically making our wages amount to less. We're able to afford less with the wages that we make now versus in the past. So as joblessness increased, a college education became the main way to make a good living, especially as these manufacturing jobs started to go away. You needed to have a college degree to be able to make it in this post-industrial or de-industrialized economy. So a lot of folks are finding themselves relying on extended family for some time. Extended family is our kin network that extends outside or beyond the nuclear family. This is especially important among working class whites and many working class Latino, Black, Asian, and some European immigrant families. Before the 1800s, people married for many reasons, but love was actually not one of them. A lot of people think that love and marriage have always gone together, but in the past, love was seen as a very foolish reason to marry somebody. It wasn't that people didn't fall in love in the past, but you were supposed to take marriage more seriously than you did your casual romances. Reasons people were married before the 1800s were to increase their labor power, to obtain money or loans from in-laws to increase their business connections, and to also improve their status and maintain political connections and royal bloodlines. When it comes to divorce, divorce is both good and bad. It can have immediate negative impacts on the children, but overall, it's probably best for children to have their parents divorce, even though it feels really terrible throughout their lifetime, possibly. In the long run, it's best to live with divorced parents than in a household where both parents do not get along or do not want to be in that marriage. Divorce is also good because it means women can freely choose to leave an unhappy marriage. One of the reasons why divorce rates were lower in the 50s, and although we want to return to those lower divorce rates, the main reason why they were lower is because women were completely financially restrained to their marriages, not to mention the religious restraints and cultural restraints surrounding them as well. Andrew Cherlin has studied the patterns of divorce and remarriage through a qualitative research piece where he interviewed several Americans, over 100 Americans who had been through this marriage go around that he refers to, meaning that they're basically serial monogamous. They divorce and then they get remarried and then they divorce again and then they get remarried again. So he realized in the interviews there was a pattern, and the pattern is that as Americans, we highly value marriage. Unlike other countries in Europe that are post-industrialized like ourselves, we haven't lost that belief in marriage. We're kind of hopeless romantics still as Americans. We really, really value this idea of marriage, but we value also individualism. And marriage and individualism are in direct conflict with each other. Marriage is about compromise. Individualism is about making yourself happy, fulfilling your dreams, and all of that stuff. So both are incompatible, but we still find people that make it work, right? But the bottom line is we're going to see this marriage go around because as a society, we highly value marriage, but we also highly value individuality, and it's hard to sacrifice your individuality. Last thing that we'll cover is socialization and social class among children. First of all parents value education and hard work. Surveys show that Black parents value education just as much as white parents, just as much as Hispanic parents, and just as much as Asian parents. But our social class position gives us different advantages in terms of the philosophies and resources that we have as to what parenting means. So from a middle class background, you might receive a concerted cultivation where you rear your child in a specific way, and we'll talk about what that is. In a working class upbringing, you might be raised in achievement of natural growth. Let's talk about these two different styles. Concerted cultivation encourages negotiation and discussion, meaning that your parents want you to hear you talk. They want to talk to you. They want you to basically, if you want a toy, they want you to explain why you should get that toy. They encourage polite questioning of authority as well. They want you to be able to speak for yourself at restaurants and at doctor's office and at dentist's office. And it also involves enrolling children in an extensive amount of organized activities as well. Concerted cultivation believes that a child is like a plant that needs just the right soil and just the right water, just the right sunlight, etc. So the benefits of concerted cultivation is that our society is set up to take these middle class values in. And so if you grew up with concerted cultivation, you're going to do much better in our society which values these things. The cost, though, is that oftentimes children get burned out by the many activities that they're in. They also don't know what to do with free time, and they develop a sense of entitlement. Moving on to accomplishment of natural growth, parents from the working class think that children just need to be children. And so they allow their children to just naturally grow into who they want to be. They have a lot of unstructured playtime. There's also a heavy emphasis on taking directives from the parent. The parent is the one who speaks for the child, and this encourages the child to develop just a trust for authority figures, and maybe kills a little bit of their critical thinking. So the benefits of natural growth is that children are more reliant at an earlier age. They're rarely bored, and they're able to structure their own activities. They also have stronger family ties since they have that loose playtime with their brothers and sisters and cousins. The cost of this, of course, is that although natural growth is valuable, our middle class society, the way that it's structured, doesn't see this value. And so this reproduces inequality among working class children who become adults and try to get into the professional world and are rejected by this social structure.